In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about switch statements. A switch statement is a shorthand mechanism of using if, else if, else if, else if, else if, else if, else statements. All right, so if you're finding that you're writing a whole bunch of if statements and it has a countable variable, so if you're saying if the value is 1, if the value is 2, if the value is 3, if the value is 4, etc., this is just a shorthand way of doing it. If you find that you can't swap out a whole bunch of if else if statements with a switch statement, and you're finding that you're putting a whole bunch of else if statements in your code, take a minute and look at the code and see if there's an easier way of coming up with what you're trying to do. But taking a look at the switch statement, you can see that we start off with the keyword switch, followed by a countable variable. A countable variable is just a variable that is either going to be an integer data type or a character. Could be also a Boolean, but in that case, it doesn't really make sense to have a switch statement. You cannot have something like a double, because somewhere between 1.1 and 1.2, there's 1.11, 1.1111, 1.111112, etc. There's an infinite number of possibilities in between. So this has to be something that's either an integer, a character, a enumeration would work. All right, so it has to be something that's countable. Next, you have the open curly brace followed by the case keyword. Inside parentheses, then, you specify a value, followed by a colon. If the value that's in here matches the value that's in this countable variable, then the statements inside here are executed. Most importantly, don't forget to put this break statement in, because if this value matches what's in the countable variable up here, the statements are executed, and when this break statement hits, execution jumps down to the area immediately following the closing curly brace for the switch statement. If this value does not match what's in here, then you go to the next case statement and it checks that one. If that one matches, then those statements are executed. If it doesn't match, then it checks the next one, and so on. If you get all the way down to the default value, the default value is like the else in an if statement. If you get all the way down to this, if none of these values match what's in the variable up here, then the default gets executed, meaning that there's no match, and sometimes people will just put a statement to indicate that. The break statement in the default is optional, but I always put it in to add inconsistency. So suppose that I had a character variable called grade, and I had the value b inside of it. I start off with my switch statement, and the variable that I'm switching on is grade. We all know that it has a value b in it right now. So it's going to come in, it's going to check the case A. It's going to say your grade is an A, and then break. Right? If it is an A, if it's an A, which we know it's not. So then it's going to come down to the B. If it's a B, it's going to say your grade is a B. You can have as many statements inside your case statement as you want. They don't just have to be system.out.printlines. They could be assignment statements. They could be ifs. They could be loops. It doesn't matter what you put inside. All right? Just because I have system.out.printlines statements in there doesn't mean that that's all that can be in there. So if I run this now, when I run it, it's going to say your grade is a B, because that's what's stored in the countable variable grade, which happens to be a B in this case. Note, if you're using integers, you don't put the quotes around it, because you're not trying to compare the character integer. You're trying to compare the actual value integer of the integer. All right, so if I change this to a C and execute it, then you'll see that your grade is a C. Now, in the next one, I have case D and case F. This is like an OR statement in a Java if statement. So if it's either a D or an F, then it's going to do system.out.println, your grade is a D or an F. All right, so if I put in either a D, it's going to say your grade is a D or an F. If I put in an F, again, it's going to say your grade is a D or an F. There is no equivalent to an AND statement, to an if statement with an AND in it in a case statement. You can only do an OR. Finally, if I don't put in any of these values, D, F, A, B, or C, let's say if I put in an E and run it, it's going to say your grade is not provided in the scale. All right, so that's how the case statement works. It's pretty straightforward, I think, and it's a nice shortcut for trying to provide, and if you have a very long if-else-if statement. One thing that I do want to caution you is to remember to put in the break statements. For example, if I take out this case here, that break statement, and I change the value to a C, then when I execute this, it's going to say your grade is a C, your grade is a D or an F. Why? Because there's no way to break out as soon as this case has been executed. So don't forget to put those break statements in. In the next video, I'm going to talk about while loops and for loops.